Kings and Second Kings are way better talked about in bulk in one of these videos. So we're going to start with a video, and then I'm going to come up and not preach at you, but preach to you for a couple minutes.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings, although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20, and then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door, or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up. Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Did you get all that? My goodness, see, I told you. You'd rather hear it from that guy than me. All right, I feel like the electronic preacher. I got my iPad, I got my clicker, my thing, my phone in the back. Let's start by praying, though. Father, wow, that's a lot, and there's a lot to learn. I'd never read the words before, but in the song that we're singing earlier, it said, "Rid me of myself." So, Lord, let me get out of the way and hopefully pass on the message that you have to give to these people, this group of ministers that go out into the community and work hard to build your kingdom every day. Allow the message to be clear. Allow them to see the things that I saw. And allow your message to go right to their hearts and their minds. We love you in Jesus' name. Amen. All right, so because what I'd like to do is focus on King Solomon. So far, there have been two kings on the throne of Israel, King Saul and King David. Now, the book of Kings begins, like he said, when King David is about 70 years old, and that's not really old for biblical times, but King David was a frail 70 because he was a warrior most of his life. So Solomon's older brother, Adonijah, while King David is on his deathbed, Adonijah decides that he wants to be the king. But one of King David's wives, Bathsheba, if you remember Bathsheba, she's the one that King David saw out the window. He fell in love with her. He sent Uriah the Hittite to the front lines to die so he could marry her. So she reminds King Solomon that her son Solomon is supposed to succeed King David on the throne. David makes this happen, makes Solomon the king, and then Solomon goes about killing the conspirators of Adonijah, those people who are going to help his older brother. When the time drew near for David to die, he said to Solomon, I am about to go the way of all the earth, he said. So be strong, act like a man, and observe what the Lord your God requires. And note this in your head, okay? Walk in obedience to him. Keep his decrees and commands, his laws and regulations, as written in the law of Moses. Do this so that you may prosper in all you do and wherever you go. Now it moves on into chapter 3. So Solomon goes to a place called Gibeon, and he's worshiping on an altar. And he burns 1,000 offerings. Now, I don't know if they were all cows. I don't know if some were sheep or goats or what, but if I tried to figure it out. I Googled how long does it take to slaughter a cow. And it could take up to 14 hours to slaughter a cow. But let's just, for sake of say that it only takes 1 hour to slaughter a cow. Okay? At 1,000 cows, that's 42 days worth of burnt offerings. So somebody was up there slaughtering and burning on the altar for 42 days. We'll just call them cows. So that night, I think the Lord was answering those burnt offerings. The Lord appeared to Solomon during the night in a dream, and God said, ask for whatever you want me to give you. And so Solomon answers, please give your servant a discerning heart to govern your people and to distinguish between right and wrong. And the Lord was pleased that Solomon, where am I at? Does that say so God said to him? Okay, good. The Lord was pleased that Solomon had asked for this. So God said to him, since you have asked for this and not for long life or for wealth, nor have you asked for death of your enemies, but discernment in administering justice, I will do what you have asked. I will give you a wise and discerning heart, and listen to this, so that there will never have been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. So that there will have never been anyone like you, nor will there ever be. Moreover, I'll give you what you have not asked for, both wealth and honor, so that in your lifetime you will have no equal among kings. Remember last time? And if you walk in obedience to me and keep my decrees and commands, as David your father did, I'll give you a long life. So, ultimately, Solomon becomes wealthy, right? At one point, they talk about what the daily provisions of the kingdom were. And they talk about this word kors, which ultimately means about 5.5 tons. 30 tons of flour and 30 tons of meal. 23 head of stall-fed cattle. Danielle, I think that's non-organic cattle. 20 of pasture-fed cattle. I was considering those the organic kind of cattle. 100 sheep and goats, as well as deer, gazelles, roebucks, and choice fowl. This is daily. So it's hard to describe the amount of wealth we're talking about. That's why I'm kind of pointing that out. Of course, he had wisdom, right? God said he was going to give him wisdom. He gave Solomon wisdom and very great insight. Solomon's wisdom was greater than the wisdom of all the people of the East and of all the wisdom of all the people of Egypt. He spoke 3,000 proverbs, which is where the book of Proverbs comes from. His songs numbered 1,005. That's where the Song of Solomon comes from. He spoke about plant life, and he spoke about animals and birds and reptiles and fish. So I think we're supposed to glean from this that Solomon was a walking encyclopedia. He was the smartest guy that you or I or anyone will ever know, even smarter than Ben Carson. So, Solomon's wisdom sent by all the kings of the world who had heard of his wisdom. And by the way, when people traveled to come and hear King Solomon talk, and whenever they came, they always brought him gifts, right? So not only was this guy wealthy, but people are constantly bringing him stuff. Then he began to build the temple that God had put on King David's heart. And preparations for the temple took 4 years, right? The temple that King Solomon built for the Lord was 60 cubits by 20 cubits by 30 cubits. So that's about 90 feet long, 30 feet wide, and 45 feet high. All right, now we're about to get into the middle portion. 1 Kings 6:38 says, Solomon spent 7 years building the temple of the Lord. And so if you can kind of think of all the things that I've talked about have been slowly building on this progression, we get to about the middle of his story and we read that he spent 7 years building the temple to the Lord. The next verse is 1 Kings 7:1. It took Solomon 13 years, however, to complete the construction of his palace. So do you see where we're headed? We're kind of on the back nine. We're kind of on the downturn. He built the palace of the forest of Lebanon. That's what the temple was called, his temple. 100 cubits long, 50 wide, and 30 feet high, 30 cubits high, so the temple of the Lord was 90 feet by 30 feet by 45. The palace of the forest of Lebanon was 150 feet long, 75 feet wide, and 45 feet. In Kings 8, the Ark of the Covenant was brought to the temple, and that's the ark that was holding the stone tablets that Moses came down off the mountain with. And then Solomon prays this awesome dedication prayer to the temple of the Lord. Does this say the Lord said to him? Perfect. All right. So I'm on track. Then the Lord appears to Solomon again. So how many times has he appeared to him? Now it's twice. The Lord said to him, I have heard the prayer and plea you made before me. I have consecrated this temple, which you've built by putting my name there forever. My eyes and my heart will always be there. As for you, remember I keep talking like this when I say that. As for you, if you walk before me faithfully with integrity of heart and uprightness, as David your father did, and do all I command and observe my decrees and laws, I will establish your royal throne over Israel forever. But if you or your descendants turn away from me and do not observe the command and decrees I've given you, and go off to serve other gods and worship them, then I will cut off Israel from the land I've given them and reject this temple, which has my name consecrated in it. So, you're seeing the pattern, I hope, right? That's the pattern. This pattern. Is that three verses right there? 1 Kings 2:3, keep the charge of the Lord, walk in his statutes and commandments, right? 1 Kings 3, if you walk in my way, keep in my statutes and commandments, I'll prolong your days. 1 Kings 6, concerning this house, if you keep my statutes and ordinance, I'll continue the line of David your father. 1 Kings 8:6, let your heart be devoted to me, therefore. Statutes and commandments at this day. 1 Kings 9:4, as for if you walk before me the way your David walked, upright, doing in accordance to all of my commandment, and keep my ordinances. And Kings 11:38, the same thing, right? Keep my statutes and commandments, then I'll be with you and build an enduring house as I built for David. And I'll give all of Israel to you. Over and over and over and over, he keeps saying it to them. But what is this guy doing? The wisest The richest, the smart, I already said wisest. The smartest, wisest, this guy has it all. And he continues to slide downward. Now, back at the beginning of the video, if you remember, the narrator talks about Deuteronomy 17, laws concerning the king. The king, moreover, must not acquire great numbers of horses. He must not take many wives, and he must not accumulate large amounts of silver or gold. So, what does he have? What does he have? I'm sorry? Yeah, he has a bunch of wives. He has a bunch of wives. He has a bunch of gold. So at one point it says that he accumulated 666 talents of gold yearly. A talent is roughly equivalent to 75 pounds, which is roughly 50,000 pounds of gold that he accumulated yearly. He had 1,400 chariots and 12,000 horses, and he had 700 wives and 300 concubines. Now, right? She's saying don't do it. She's saying don't do it. What can I say about 700 wives? There's a lot I can say about 700 wives. Let's just say it like this. That's a lot of weddings. Can you imagine the planning involved in that, right? That's 3 years worth of weddings. I'm not even going to talk about how many pairs of shoes that is with 1,000 women, right? So that's as far as I'm going. But the thing about these women is that it says that he truly loved them. And they were foreigners. So does that mean that God didn't want any of the Israelites to marry foreign women? Well, it does and it doesn't. It does mean that because it doesn't mean that because he had anything against foreigners. What he did have against them is the fact that they were going to introduce their gods to him. They were going to get him to look at their gods, to worship their gods, because he loved his wife, right? Happy wife, happy life, worship her God. So who are some of the guys that he ended up worshiping to? One's called Ashtoreth. Ashtoreth, if you ever heard of an Asherah pole, Ashtoreth has to do with divination. Molech was a god that they did child sacrifice. So these are the kinds of things that Solomon found himself doing because he had 700 wives. Because he was falling away from the Lord, because he had accumulated all this stuff, because he wasn't focused and concentrating on what he was supposed to concentrate on. So Solomon did evil in the eyes of the Lord. He didn't follow the Lord completely, as David his father had done. Does this say 11:9? Perfect. The Lord became angry with Solomon because his heart had turned away from the Lord, the God of Israel, who had appeared to him twice. Although he had forbidden Solomon to follow other gods, Solomon did not keep the Lord's command. The Lord said to Solomon, since your attitude and you have not kept my covenant, my decrees, which I commanded you, I'm going to tear the kingdom away from you. And this is where the text goes on to talk about several people that God raises up against Solomon. And then the kingdom breaks up into a couple of different parts, and his son becomes a successor. But slowly but surely, each king, one after another, what they say, the guys from the southern kingdom were 0 for 20, and the other guys were 8 for 20. That's not really a very good track record. So we look at what's going on with Solomon, and if you remember a couple months ago, I was up here talking about the old covenant versus the new covenant. And the old covenant is what God gave to the Israelites. If If you do this, I will do this. If you do this, I will do this. And we heard this time and time again, didn't we? If you do this, I will do this. I will give you wealth. I'll give you honor. I'll give you long days. I'll give you the kingdom. That's the old covenant, but we live by the new covenant, don't we? The new covenant says, if you believe in Jesus, you will be saved. And that new covenant is given to all of us. So, of course, there's things that we take from what's going on with King Solomon, right? Because there's all kinds of lessons. I mean, if we pray to God, God listens to our prayers. If we honor God, God honors us back. I think the biggest takeaway, I never realized the title that God had given to King Solomon. That statement where he will be the wisest and the mostest and all those things forever and ever, amen, right? He was the guy. He was the guy back then. He's going to be the guy then. God did not give as much to anyone else, nor will he give as much to anyone else that he gave to King Solomon. That was the guy on the planet. But all of that he gave him, and even Solomon still fell and turned away. There's still that opportunity. So I look at that guy and say, if that happened to him, man, I better guard my heart. I have to doubly, triply, thousandly, whatever I got to do. I got to guard my heart, because if it can happen to him, it can happen to me. And I would not be able to deal with 700 wives. I just wouldn't. So since we're talking about the new covenant, we a couple of weeks ago, some of us went to listen to Andy Stanley in Claremont, and he wrote a book, and it's called Deep and Wide, and what we learned a ton. I learned a ton of stuff. I brought a ton of stuff back with me. But we learned a lot about how a very thriving church in Atlanta, Georgia, does their best to meet the needs of the unchurched. Okay, that's when we started Go Church, that was our intention. Our intention is to go out and make disciples. Our intention is to go into the community to make Jesus famous, right? By making everything new with Jesus, to go out there and let the community know who we are, and that there's a place for them, that they can be comfortable, they can learn about God, and that and learn about how Jesus can transform their lives. So one in particular thing, and I'm going to take we're going to take about 10 minutes here. One in particular thing, guys, if you want to grab the survey for me. You know, it took me about 10 minutes. I sat down and I took this survey. We wrote a survey because we want to know where you guys are at. So what we're about to do is pass out the survey and some pens, and what I'd like you to do is take 10 minutes and read the questions and answer them as honestly as possible. I want you to put your name on it, but you don't have to. We want to know what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. We want to know how we can better equip and serve you as ministers that go out into the community every week. Do you have a question about what our DNA is? Do you have a question about how better you can talk to people about God? Do you have a ministry that's on your heart that you're a little bit fearful of starting because of commitment? Whatever it happens to be. These are the questions that I came up with. I asked some of the guys to look at them and edit them. And there's no right or wrong answers. This is not about making you feel like you're not doing your part. This is about us taking the information and finding a starting point, and then being able to celebrate when we get better. You know, over the past couple of days, I've been talking to a lot of people, and I've been hearing about a lot of things that are really celebration worthy. And that's part of our DNA. We want to celebrate the things that are happening in this room and in that community. And they're popping up because I'm focused on looking for them. We want to do a better job of focusing on looking for those. Where are our opportunities? How can we help? So I'm going to be quiet.
Amen.
I don't have to say anymore. Take the time, fill them out, and we'll pray in about 10 minutes. Thanks.